So we want to welcome today local resident Scott Saewert, and he's bringing his program, South Pacific of Fathers World War II Journey, Revisited New Caledonia. This is part 3 of a 3-part series. If you missed the other ones and you would like to see them, let us know. We do have encore recordings of all of these programs. So welcome, Scott.
Well, thank you very much, Terry. And thank you all for being a part of either revisiting my father's journey revisited or visiting it for the first time today. Those that brave the weather, I appreciate it. And I hope that we can all learn about New Caledonia together. Just a poll quickly, who heard of New Caledonia before maybe seeing the series? So, okay, there's three people out of 12. That's pretty good. And on Zoom, they can raise their hands, I suppose, right, Terry? But anyway, that's what this is all about, is now going back to the islands, which I need to just do a little technical thing here for us and revisit where my father was. Those that have been on here before know that he was in the Army Corps of Engineers. He was in for 3.5 years. Right there, my mother was a little bit more, Mike. Thank you. Right there, my mother was visiting him at Camp White, Oregon before he went overseas. And she was, he was 20 and a half, maybe 21 by then, and she was probably about 19. So, so this is where it begins. And like I said, he was in the Army Corps of Engineers. My daughter did one of her senior theses about the letters. There was thousands of letters he wrote home. And this was an oral interview that we work off of. And this was the end of our trip. So it's the last in our sequence here today. But it really was the beginning of my father's journey back in 1943. So what we see here is just briefly when he was inducted, he went to Camp Grant, which is now Rockford International Airport, and went by train to Camp White for about 6 months, shipped to California then by train, ready to embark overseas. So he noted here and told my daughter that they left on June 14th. And back then they had observation balloons that would look for submarines. So the balloons followed them for, here he says 4 days, there's another place he says 1. But once the balloons left them, there was no more observing for submarines, and they were a lone ship. There was not in a convoy. They were just one ship out on the Pacific Ocean. What also happened was it took them about 3 weeks to get there on the seas. I think it was about 940 miles by ship. With New Caledonia, there was a beautiful harbor, he had noted. They had just landed just after the Battle of Midway. So if you know of some of the history, the Battle of Midway was critical in the US turning of the war and stopping Japan and actually maybe turning it back to Japan. When they did get there, they were trucked to a place from Noumea, New Caledonia, the capital, to Noumea, which is right next door. And they set up tents and camped there, only to have a hurricane blow everything away. He said that supplies were replenished, which we'll see a little bit later what it was. And he mentioned about the explosion, the loudest explosion you could ever hear in your life. It was an explosion that happened at the nickel docks. The nickel docks were a dock in New Caledonia that a mining company that mined nickel owned, and it was one of the major ports there. So it was a significant port, and it was the ammunition being unloaded from one of the ships blew up right there. He said it was the French did it. and they were called Vichy, and it's actually spelled Vichy. They were dangerous because they allied with the Nazis and the Japanese. France was torn in two because of the Nazi occupation. There were the people who wanted to be free French and the people who wanted to be allied with the Nazis, the Vichy with the Nazis. He blamed them. During that time, he was moved from a line company working equipment, heavy equipment, trucks, to headquarters and supply, and in the motor pool where he served as a mechanic to work on all those different pieces of equipment. And then he mentioned that the rest of the regiment built hospitals. And then from there, they went to New Hebrides, which was where we were on the first presentation. This is actually some handwritten notes. He was trying to document some things from years ago. And probably the most impactful things, he was talking about the trip that he took from Camp White and all that. But more importantly, he said the entire regiment, so they loaded the entire regiment in this one ship. So if that ship would have been submarined or torpedoed, that entire regiment would have been gone. So you'll see what the consequences would have been if that happened. There's 1,300 people on there. There's 10 or 11 Army nurses. And he remembers very much that one of the nurses was kind. And I would sing a song that he never forgot, which was Deep Purple. So with 3 weeks being on the ocean, it was very difficult because many of the troops got sick. And he said he was lucky that he didn't get sick. But one of the detriments of it was the fact that they'd have to go in the hull of the ship at nighttime. And when they did that, there's 1,300 people down there. And can you imagine all the sick people down there? And he said in the notes, he doesn't even want to tell you how bad it was. But on top of that, he also said there was no ventilation in the ship. So it must have been 3 weeks of just absolutely waiting for a breath of fresh air. So they did finally they made it to New Caledonia safely. And then the journey begins in New Caledonia. We mentioned, should have mentioned the troop ship he was on. It was the USS Grant. And that history from naval history it was a German commercial steamer built in 1907. And it became, I think, the War Department's after the World War I, and was used pretty much extensively in the Pacific area. So it made its final voyage in November of 1945, and then actually was destroyed in 1948. But it's funny how it went from Germany. It was called the King Wilhelm II, and became a U.S. troop ship to fight against the Axis forces. Here's a picture of it. This was in 1938, and that's when I think the Navy had a lot of their ships painted in white, calling it the White Navy. For World War II, it was painted gray to give it more subdued profile. And those that had been here before know that this was the trip that he took once around the globe there. But in this particular journey, like I said, it was over 900 miles. I think they refueled somewhere in between, but it took 3 solid weeks to get there. Another depiction of the area we're going to be in. New Caledonia is in the left lower part. Directly north is Guadalcanal. Then last week we were in the New Hebrides, which was to the upper right. But you'll see the Battle of the Coral Sea and how close it was to that campaign area. And the Battle of the Coral Seas was a week before Midway, so it was like, I suppose, 3 weeks or so before they landed. And at the Coral Sea, we didn't win it tactically, but it was declared that we actually won it strategically. So I think that gave us the impetus for the Battle of Midway. New Caledonia looks like this. It's a long, thin island with some surrounding islands, which you have it's located, Noumea is located in the lower right-hand corner, or lower left-hand corner, sorry, of the lower tip of it. And Noumea, if you can see it, is right next to it. And then the close-up is below it of the harbor. You can see what a great natural harbor it has with islands and the coves and everything else that offers it for a port or a place for ships to go. So why was New Caledonia important? Actually, they were going to build this base in Auckland, and New Caledonia was going to be like a fuel stop. But with the advent of the turning of events with Coral Sea, Battle of the Coral Sea, and Midway, they were able to locate this base like 900 miles farther, closer to the Solomon Islands. The island is 250 miles long, it's 31 miles wide. The harbors are deep, anywhere from 20 to 50 fathoms, so they're at least 20 feet and deeper. And there's a lot of fresh water on the island, which many of the Pacific islands don't have. Back then, the population of the whole New Caledonia was 55,000, and today it's 278,000. Noumea was 11,000. Now it is about 92,000 people. But it was the chief French city there, and you'll see why it's called the Paris of the Pacific, the South Pacific. With knowing that it was a free French island, it was voted free French in 1940. The Vichy tried to take it over, but through election, it was made a free French island. And by 1942, March, the French and the US Army signed an agreement that they would have bases there. And by, I think, June 10th of 42, the Navy took over all the harbor activity. So they basically gave the island to them in many ways. Like I said, it was slow to proceed at first because they were originally building up Auckland, but then diverted CB units in order to start construction over in Noumea. So this was a little depiction of our trip. So last time we left you, we were in Port Vila, which was kind of in the middle of that the three-legged spider there. And then we went southwest down to New Caledonia. It's about 355 miles. That was the sunset scene I left you last time with, just to draw you into the South Pacific. I should be singing some Enchanted Island, but you don't want to hear me do that. But so that was Port Vila, and it's still a French-speaking island. That's Afate. That's where Port Vila is. And just take a note of the airport. I always have to comment about the cultural exhibits that are noted at the airport, and this is one of them where they made us safe by taking a can of Coke and some hand cream, and I think there's a little bottle of Kahlua, so we were very safe. I'm happy they did get some steak knives and a few other knives there, some scissors. But the most interesting thing there in the right-hand corner is a slingshot. A slingshot, so you can't have slingshots on the aircraft either. So that was the aircraft that we flew 355 miles to New Caledonia, Noumea. And this is a picture of the airfield we landed on. It's called La Tantuta. It was originally built by the Seabees in 42. It was 4,000 feet. They needed more or heavier aircraft to come in, so they added another 1,000 to 5,000 feet. And then from there to this day, that airfield is actually an international field, which is 10,000 feet long. This was the terminal, so it was so markedly different than, than what you saw just now at Port Vila. It's truly, I mean, you start to get the feeling of the cosmopolitan feeling of this island, and so different than the other feelings we had with the past two islands, or 4 or 5 islands that we were on. While we were there, it's the air base for the New Caledonia Air Force, which is part of the French Air Force. This was a French, I think it was an Air Force craft that was there. They were actually doing military maneuvers with the French Army. And it's getting to be very common in the South Pacific that there's military presences, mainly because of China and the foothold they're trying to take in the South Pacific. I should have mentioned last week in Espiritu Santo, the Australians were developing a barracks so that they'd actually have a garrison there. This is the airfield in August of 1942. So it's definitely come a long way, and to the point where it's now 6,000 feet longer. This picture was great because it not only shows amphibious aircraft there, PBY, but we talked about last week about the panels the Marston panels that the engineers and the Seabees would put down on the coral to smooth the surface so the aircraft could have better landing traction capability. So that shows you the Marston mat all in place on a major airfield. We got to our hotel, and my father was right. It's a very beautiful harbor. So that was overlooking we were overlooking our room there. And this looked at the eel, or the island called New, which is, again, the bays and the waters are just absolutely gorgeous. We also went to the Riviera. The Hotel Stanley, which is where we stayed, was on the street of the Riviera. So Janet and I did go to the Riviera one way or another. Here's a picture of Noumea around 1942. You can start to see the buildup of the Quonset huts and all of the military warehousing that went on there. But I never knew this. During World War II, New Caledonia was the second largest base next to Pearl Harbor. So it just talks to the immensity of the harbor and what they were able to do there. If you look, there's ships in the background, other docks, a lot of activity going on. And this is another picture from a different view showing more of the harbor, some of the docks, and then the high concentration of buildings there. So to give you an idea of the extent of it, in October of 42, there was about 118 total ships, cargo, transport, everything there. And within 5 to 6 months, there was over 120 ships waiting in the bay in order to get into the harbor and dock and then unload. Like I mentioned earlier, it was primarily it's supposed to be a fuel stop. So there's a fuel depots there. The bottom picture, it's a little fuzzy. I apologize for that on the big screen, but and we have the closed captioning there as well. But it's another dock with ships floated there and a seaplane base that they had. And it was very extensive in what they could do there. We'll see a little video about this is where they overhauled diesel engines and had also a spare part warranty, or sorry, car business part, spare part warehouses. And if you've ever seen a ship's diesel engine, some of the diesel engines are bigger than this room. So that's why they needed immense facilities, and that almost looked like Amazon warehouses. So I was luckier on this set of islands because they had assembled for their reunion some pictorial history of the 353rd engineer service regiment. And naturally, they had their forward, which basically talks about what they learned, their camaraderie, really what they tried to accomplish, which was basically to fight Hitler in Tokyo. And they more or less put a lot of it, their success, on discipline and working together as a successful organization. The coat of arms they created in Oregon, it's interesting, symbolic. In color, it's scarlet, like a scarlet color, which is the Army's designation for engineers. So it's scarlet, and then you'll see like 3 items on top. That's all engineer equipment, sexton equipment. There's 5 rods there, which is used by engineering, as well as broad axes to build things. So when you add that all up, you have 3 and 5 and 3, which represents their regiment. And then their motto, which is in a little scroll below it, is "By a strong hand." They dedicated the book to the colonel who was in command. Interesting guy, born the son of a Presbyterian minister, but his travel log reads like an army brat. Born in Minnesota, grows up in Monterey, California, moves to Illinois. Must have been in Peoria area. Valedictorian of his high school class, attended Bradley University and then West Point. He was top in his company class. Then he goes to engineering school, Virginia. From there, he goes to Hawaii at Schofield Barracks. And then from there, he comes back and he goes to Washington. And then from there, Portland in Oregon, and then eventually taking control of the 353rd the Engineer General Service Regiment in 42 to 44. And then to carry it through the war, he was in charge of the 1177th. And then in the occupation forces in Japan, he was there as well. I happened to see his picture when I was involved in some things, actually with the local government. And we went to the Army Corps of Engineer office in Chicago, and his picture's on the wall. He was the commanding engineer there from 46 until about 51. So very interesting career all over the world. He brought his dog everywhere he went. I don't know what the dog's name is, sorry. I wish I did. And in the booklet, they talk about their new home in New Caledonia, and a little summary of arriving there, then going to Noumea. And when they got there, it was just this open valley, and it was described like a cow pasture, which there was nothing to do there, and there was nowhere to stay there. But little did they know they were going to build it all. The pictures of the chaplain being greeted by one of the Noumeans, and it's also a picture of the valley. I drew on some of the like a diary that one of my dad's colleagues had written, Paul Dieter, and he actually lived in Naperville and ran a trucking company after the war. These are some of the excerpts that he wrote about being trucked to Noumea. And then what they were doing then was making roads wider for two-way traffic and building camps and hospitals. He mentioned that the New Zealanders built a hospital there, and they were close to a cavalry unit, which had horses from Australia and New Zealand, and they did maneuvers up in the mountains. So to support all of those statements, here's pictures of road building and bridge building. And on the bottom where the closed captions are, those are like cuts through hills and rocks in order to make the roads flatter. So there's more information about this. They worked in with stone crushers, gravel pits, hot mix plants, concrete mixers, lumber yards to build the hospital. So basically, they had to obtain their own materials. And at first they had insufficient equipment, small trucks. They had a D2 cat, which is a bulldozer, which is very small. And what happened was, in order for them to keep the timetable, they had to work 14-hour days, 7 days a week. And I remember reading letters from my father about how he couldn't write because he was so tired. And they just, if they weren't 22 years old, they probably would have been worked to death. Oddly enough, when other troops were seeing them working on the roads, they kind of jeered at them because they thought they were prisoners. So, but here's pictures of the things that they built. Water tower on the left, elevated water towers on the right for the hospital. Again, more of the roads that they built. Route 1, which is the main road in and out of Noumea. There's some of the heavy equipment that he was talking about. There's a roller, which would compact the roads. They built a gravel plant for not only gravel, but for concrete. They had a quarry and a rock crusher. And then reading some of the history, if you see in the right-hand corner, the rock crusher is there. It's very small, so they actually worked that almost 24 hours, unless it was broken. There's Colonel Trower's dog. He's got a little dog. They engineered a dog door even back then, which was kind of cool. The mess sergeant had something different to make, like when they caught an eel. There's a fellow in the middle left there. He's got a French, like a French Foreign Legion hat on. And I'm not sure what he's doing. And there's a picture of the gravel plant with the conveyor belt, and then some entertainment that they happen to have. They built a place for themselves, a camp for themselves. Mostly it was tents. There were some buildings, hard buildings, but they were given the assignment to build a general hospital, which is quite a complex. You can basically do anything there. It's not an evacuation hospital or a temporary field hospital. It's a hospital where they have full services for everything. This was going to be about 90 buildings. I think by that time they had better equipment had come in. Oh no, I'm sorry. This is the 8th. They did not have the good equipment then. So you can see all of the building pictures of the concrete slabs, and then the trusses that were built, and water lines that were installed, and just building every one of the buildings individually. More roads. What was fascinating was the fact that you see some of the buildings with the palm leaf roofs. So since they lacked a lot of material, some of the buildings that were less important did not get a wooden or a metal roof. And I think the one picture up in the upper right is like a mess hall and quarters, and then the other one was a chapel. It didn't have a hard roof on it. And in the lower corner is a picture of a POW camp they built for the Japanese prisoners. So we're going to go to the next thing they worked on, which is called the Nickel Bridge. And I mentioned a little bit about it before. It was a nickel mine. It has 1/10 the world's reserve of nickel in it, in that little island, which is pretty spectacular. The nickel dock was really insufficient for the warehousing and the volumes of goods that were being brought in to support the war effort. So they actually had to enlarge it. These are pictures of the enlargements going on with the smaller bulldozers there. And then they're putting down footings or curbs and pouring concrete. And then the lower right-hand corner is their hot mix or their concrete mixer. And there's lime and the other chemicals bags that are used to make the concrete. So the left middle picture shows that when it was finished, it was widened, and then to support the dock facilities, they built warehouses behind it in the same area. It's really, I never knew what an interesting story this was until now. So there was an explosion there. My father told me about it. I said, and he's not the only one that said it was the loudest noise he's ever heard in the world. You probably could hear. So on November 1st of 1943, there was a huge explosion. And this is actually from a French resident there. Firefighters, ambulances, police, everybody went over there to put out the fire and to rescue the wounded. They claimed there was like 90 people that were basically killed because the missing were never found and another 90 injured. And they were lucky in a way because oddly enough, it was on a French holiday, All Saints Day. So any of the nickel mining people that were working there weren't there. So the only people that were hurt or killed were Americans. Paul Dieter said, now my dad said, is she French? Paul Dieter said a two-man submarine came in, found its way to the harbor and blew up the nickel dock. They were given the job to rebuild it in 72 hours in order to get supplies in and out. So in just doing some research about this, some from the Navy, some from World War II history, they talk about it. There was 4 ships there. The Seabees built the docks, but during handling munitions, so they're unloading the munitions, there was an accidental explosion, which was called the nickel dock explosion. Here they said 100 people died, men were lost, and 100 were wounded. The ships were okay. They were taken from their moorings, but the explosion was for years classified and now declassified, but there's hardly any data available about it. Ben was an eyewitness, which was on some websites that I found. And he said he was the officer in charge and he was there within 8 to 10 minutes. The explosions and the munitions blowing off lasted for 4.5 hours. So there's just fire and shells everywhere in the air. 7 of his men were injured, no fatalities. And again, explosion was for years classified, now declassified. And he was interested in finding the actual cause, but he was unable to find any information about it. This is from a website from the 93rd Seabees, which they happened to be in the harbor on a ship at the very moment it happened. And they mentioned too, early in the afternoon, an enormous explosion of ammunition in the harbor set off continuing explosions for 4 more hours. And it was, the concussion wave was so great that the ship that they were on, the transport ship, rocked back and forth. So it was obviously just an absolutely incredible explosion. And furthering the story, some of the eyewitnesses, they were apparently unaware of the tragedy, and it was really classified by the US government until 1947, where they even admitted that there was an explosion there. And victims who had survived it were given, they were considered non-combat related conditions on their medical records. So when they sought some disability or further treatment, they were denied it. They were denied it. One of the eyewitnesses also did a website, and once he did the website, a lot of well, he mentioned the explosion was classified for military records. All of the medical records of the wounded men were noted as natural causes. Natural causes, and they were denied benefits of continuing medical care, and even the dignity of the admission that the explosion had occurred long after the declassification. There's a picture of it. You can see the intensity of the fire and the explosion there at the nickel dock. This is a picture my dad had. And what it shows is the nickel dock after the explosions had all ended. And Terry, we're without a screen here. Oh, there we go. You got it. Thank you. That shows the nickel dock, and you can have an idea. I don't want to, this usually freezes the screen, but you can see all the debris all over the nickel dock and things that are blown apart or blown around. And at the very end, can't see it because of this closed caption, but the ambulance is there. So that was right after the time that the dock had the fire, and they had to clean it up. After they're rebuilding it, it looked like that, so they were able to do the work that was necessary to unload all the ships there. And this was kind of an interesting find, because as I'm going through some searches on this, here's a William K. Steele from Georgia. He died in the South Pacific. Like they said, this is actually from, I think, Pinterest. And William never returned from the war. His family never knew what had happened to him. Her mother was talking to William's mother. They were sisters. And his mother said, the government won't tell us what happened to William. Well, he was killed on November 1st in Noumea, trying to help put out the fire. And they really knew nothing about this until one of their relatives went on, again, the internet, and found that website where they talked about it and had the eyewitnesses talk about it. And they finally knew what had happened to him. So it says here that this story was classified until 1976. So I thought, well, how many years is that? Almost 50. Let's find out what happened, right? What happened at the nickel docks? My dad said it was Vichy French, Japanese submarine, unloading the ammunition. So I went to the National Archives. You can see the second box. Counterintelligence files. That's where it was picked up. And it talked about the explosion of the naval ammunition dump. The investigation was in on June 11th of 43. It actually happened on November 1st of 43. So they're off on that date. So I wanted to click on it just to see what had happened, right? So what happened was it goes to a page that says potentially harmful content alert. See NARA's statement. And the statement says, Siri contains records, some of which may not be available online. And if you want to see them, you have to visit the National Archives or request the information at the contact information below. And if you look down at the bottom of the page, there's no information. So this is truly, it seems to be a mystery to this day. So if we have any aspiring detectives or novel writers, this may be a fascinating story to cover, because there doesn't seem to be any reason for it. So 2 months later, a tropical hurricane hit them, destroyed all their tents, parts of most of the hospital that they built, the 8th hospital, and the village that they also lived in. Paul also mentioned about many of the people. I think these were obviously the indigenous people, but they had different types of diseases like leprosy and elephantitis. Leprosy probably isn't a surprise, because New Caledonia, some of the islands were used as a leper colony. And this is a little bit story in the booklet that talks about it. They couldn't say hurricane because it might give an idea when they're writing letters of where, when you know where hurricanes are, you could place what islands they were on. So they had to code it Dorothy Lamour wind. So it must have been kind of a hot wind. They noted that the tents closed, everything was just flying around like they were in a hurricane. It's like a tornado in many ways. The only thing after this subsided, after several hours, was one of the mess halls stood and the latrine stood. So fortunately, they had the basics to rebuild everything back. These are pictures from what the destruction was. Upper left hand is the imploded officers' quarters. There's the mess hall. The mess hall, you can see it's just got like a lattice. There's no roof on it. So that one had the palm leaf construction, and everything was blown off of it. Their parade ground was a lake, and it didn't matter where they were. There was destruction everywhere. There was like a rest camp, a convalescent camp that was destroyed, and when the water subsided, they had to go right back and rebuild it. So that was the 8th General Hospital. And once they rebuilt it, they were given the task to build another one. So I think you can imagine the volume of surgical and medical care that was needed by building another general hospital there. So these are all pictures of laying the footings and grading it and constructing the building itself. And many, many construction pictures with the nurses' quarters, and they put in sidewalks. They built the foundations and footings for the water tanks that you saw earlier, and graded the roads, made roads for the area. They also had to do the interior. So you see there the sterilizing room, there's a chapel, the dental lab, a surgical room. There's one of the wards with beds there, and a picture of the hospital was so extensive that the photographer had to take 2 separate pictures of it, one looking northeast at the bottom, and then at the top there, southwest. So another huge complex. Because of the inclement weather, the winds, they also built covered walkways so the patients wouldn't have to be affected by the weather when they were being transferred to different wards. And to finish it up, there's the officers' mess, one of the kitchens. It looked like a modern day station kitchen there where they could pick whatever they wanted, but I'm sure it wasn't. And then there's also treatment rooms, and the enlisted men's mess hall, which is down in the bottom left, was just picnic tables. So, and then finally there was what they called the psycho ward on the bottom right-hand corner, which would be for today's PTSD patients. One of the entrance of the general hospital. And now these are pictures, I think, from my dad's album that showed the extensiveness of the hospitals. The 29th in the upper left is in the foreground, and then the 8th General Hospital is behind it. You can hardly see it, but it's behind it. This is a picture of them going to work. They had their seatbelts on, every one of them, I'm sure. And I think I counted 15 people on that truck. So this is their lumber company, or their lumber area. They would cut trees and then have a sawmill and then dry them and then use them for construction. Another storage area and where they did maintenance. That's a picture of one of the larger trucks they got later on that helped them do more work. He was approved to, I think, drive just about anything. So here's a picture of him on I think it's like a D2 bulldozer. And another with him on a crane. And during the time that they were there, there's a thing called dengue fever. And it's a terrible tropical disease. It's spread by mosquitoes. It causes high fever, headache, rash, and really severe joint and muscle pain. The nickname for it was called the breakbone disease because it felt like your bones broke. So he was sick for several weeks with that, and so were many others. So there's a picture of him in the hospital. And the same hospital, not during when he was there, but Eleanor Roosevelt in her Red Cross outfit made a visit. This guy had severe injuries that he was being treated for. And kind of a cultural shot of ritual that was being done by the Kanaks, and two people, you can see them in dark outfits. They were two nurses that joined in on the festivities. And what was really important back then was every regiment would have a band. Why? For morale. They didn't have really personal radios. They might sing, they might play some kind of instrument that they brought along, but the bands were integral into having good morale. So they had their own band. And there's a picture of the band stand with the motion picture screen behind it. And then those tents to the right were where the guys in the outfit my father lived in. They look like little villas, don't they? Not really. This is a clip I had, just give you the idea of the energy that these bands had. This happened to be a Noumea band in a Navy band in Noumea. Holiday. But it was all show. So, you know, they really wanted to put on a great show, and it was well received for the morale part of it. Another task they had was to go out about 40 miles out into the sea to an island called Embo. So you can see where Noumea is. They'd have to go through the bay there and then out to the open sea. It's covered in the book itself, the regimental book that they put together. And so here's the diary note that they went to Embo, and it was nicknamed Snake Island. And they built fortifications there for the US Navy to replicate what they would encounter on shorelines in Tarawa, which hadn't been taken, an island that was going to be invaded. So they built it to the specifications of the Navy. And while they were there, they had to wear like leggings, which they're like extensions that make your shoes into boots. So it raises up your protection of maybe about another 14 inches from your shoe. And why they did that was the snakes were all around. And apparently one of the medics wanted to see if they were poisonous. So they had a monkey, and they wanted somebody to catch a snake. So in this case, I think Paul caught the snake and brought it over to them. He had his hand on it behind the head of the snake. And they told him, okay, give me the snake. And he couldn't let go. He was so afraid to let it go. So somehow they wrestled it out of his hand, and they let it experiment on a monkey, and the monkey died within seconds. So they knew that they really had to be careful with the snakes there. The Navy came in and they brought destroyers and other types of ships. They bombarded it with the smaller cannons, like 5 inches. They checked it and found that it had no effect. So they realized they had to use their larger guns in order to be effective in Tarawa. So it was a great experiment. Pictures of this show them, that's the island, it's just a coral island, there's no mountains. And Paul said you could, I think, walk around it in about a half an hour. So they used small landing crafts, and they brought their equipment on the beach. They actually built fortifications with barbed wire, and the pillboxes were either above ground or below ground. Most of them made out of wood logs, which the Japanese found so effective in Mount Austin and Guadalcanal. So here's a great shot where they're showing that they brought in the logs and the trucks and boats and equipment to get this done. This picture was marked Embo, but I don't think it was. It just doesn't, it looks like there's mountains in the back. But why it's interesting is the river there is probably the Noumea. And I thought at first it was a duck, like the ducks in Wisconsin Dells. You know, you probably see in there Philadelphia. These are old trucks that have boat bodies on them. They'll transport about 20 people. This is something different though. You see how small it is. And this turned out to be called a GPA, which meant general purpose amphibious. And what that is it's a Jeep with a boat body on it. And it could go on the land or it could go in shallow fordings like this. The manpower was always critical on New Caledonia. So the US paid the Kanaks or the indigenous folks there to be part of the militia. The militia force was 2,000, and of 2,800 were the islanders. Here they have French helmets, and General Patch hired them, and he's reviewing his troops. They're all in khakis, which the French military was insulted because the militia were supposed to wear white, but we paid for it. And here's a picture of one of the Kanaks, which were guarding, and I think he didn't get the clothes allotment yet, but nevertheless, it didn't stop him from doing his job. When we were in town, the main visit was to visit the museum, the curator, but we did sightseeing, and you can see the difference from the past couple presentations. The architecture and the building structure is that of Europe, and just basically like you would see in France. This was the Catholic Church. They even had built a grotto. And on the premises was a statue of Joan of Arc, a commemoration statue of Joan. If you look in the background, you can see all the buildings. We may as well, I mean, it could very well be, other than the palm trees, be in somewhere in France. Speaking of the buildings, the Quonset hut, which we've seen quite a bit of, had a tremendous population there in New Caledonia. There's at least 20 of them in that picture. And they like to, the New Caledonians like to call the American times the American years. So the museum, it's the Musée de la Seconde Guerre Mondiale, which is the Museum of the Second World War. You can see by the roof line, it's not a conventional structure. And some of their own material said it was originally a Free French Naval Forces building, and it was used for storing military equipment after that. But in 2013, the Noumea, city of Noumea took it over and turned it into a very sophisticated museum. There you can see it actually was a Quonset hut, and I thought it was maybe a replica, but it is a real Quonset hut that was built back in the 40s. Some of their sophisticated displays were this. You're actually sitting in a room, and the LED displays are in the floor. So what's simulating is you're flying in an aircraft over Noumea and the islands. So you come upon, you find naval ships out in the harbor waiting to come in. And in the upper left-hand corner, there's a display that shows an airplane flying, moving very slowly. So that really was where you're at.
They must narrate this, huh?
So hundreds and hundreds of ships.
Headphones.
Now we're getting to the Île Nue, which is the new island. What I wanted to do here was kind of fast forward it. There's an echo. It sounds like my voice. Can't get a hold of this. I think that the box might stop me from doing what I need to do. Oh no, it's like I can't do it. Anyway, they take you through the entire island area, and anything that's golden in color, like the circles there, were military bases or installations or repair areas on the islands put in place by the U.S. So there was just extensive building there. I'll try one more time to move it. This box. about that. So you can see now there's the Nickel Docks itself, and then you're flying over the Noumea ports there that's circled, and then the numerous military installations that are just everywhere on the island. And there's some aircraft that are flying below us, very imaginative. And then finally we come upon an airstrip there. So I thought that was very creative in what they did do. So once we were in there, we saw this we didn't hear thunder, did we? This mural, which was a period piece that depicts like the French sailors and the US sailors and the local New Caledonians, along with the Kanaks, dancing together at one of the band's shows that they had. And there's a vehicle in there, which very much is like the one that they went to work on. So that's they piled in as many people as they could in that vehicle. This had to be a display left over from the training that went on there. It's a cutaway of a Jeep motor. They'd use that for training the mechanics back then. So some of the stuff that I'm sure was left there. We all know Jeeps can go anywhere and they can go vertical. And this definitely proves it. They imaginatively had the Jeep on the wall. So maybe it was the one that my father and his best friend Captina drove around in. You never know. But throughout the museum were displays of actual items that people had during that time. They're not reproductions, they're all actual. This is of the Japanese soldier. Shows the rifle and their rank boards, what rank they were. It showed a uniform, and then that white piece that looks like a rag was one of their battle flags. This booth was, or diorama, was dedicated to the Free French soldiers. New Caledonia sent like a battalion to Europe to fight for France. And they fought from North Africa, which was the beginning of the Europe conquest, all the way through to the liberation of Paris and France itself. Their symbol was the cross of Lawrence or Laurent. It's a double cross. It signifies more or less reuniting. It was used during World War I. It was used in the 1600s, and that was what their shoulder patch was. This diorama just showed naval outfits with their duffel bags and some of their personal items with the aircraft carrier in the background. More naval items, life preservers. The one on the right, the blue one, is called the May West, mostly used by people on shipboard. The yellow one is for pilots because it's so thin, it was inflatable. And then on the bottom, it's the bottom of the yellow preserver is a belt type that they would inflate, and most of the troops would have those type of life preservers on. If you were in an administrative office, you'd see the Underwood typewriter and the telephones and maps and pamphlets and books, along with coffee cups and cream pictures. This was a diorama for the Australian soldiers, showing some of their equipment and their flag. And this was a diorama of the US tent. You can see the picture of the tent to the left. Type of tents they all stayed in, and a lot of the paraphernalia they'd be using at the camp, like the gas lantern, which is over there. These are collapsible canvas water buckets, and just a lot of the different paraphernalia that they'd be using. This is definitely out of either the 29th or the 8th hospital. One of their ward beds, along with it looks like maybe a surgical chair for ensuring certain positions for surgery, and other items that obviously came from the hospital's crutches and trays, feeding trays, etc. There was notices of Hollywood stars that came on the island, whether they were in service or came through the USO. Some of them were, that's Cary Grant, Spencer Tracy, Esther Williams, Katharine Hepburn, and there's Randolph Scott there as well that I recognized. So there's quite a few Hollywood stars that they were proud of that had been there. And what would my presentations be without Coke bottles, right? Right? Coke bottles. And New Caledonia had a very impressive Coke bottle display. And what's really helpful is we, from some information from the museum, we learned out why there's so many Coke bottles. So when General Patch took over the Army forces in the that section of the war, he considered Coca-Cola to be a morale booster. And he set a goal that every service person should be able to drink 1 Coke a day. So you can imagine how many Coca-Colas that was, 365 Cokes just for one person, right? So here's a picture of them getting themselves on an absolute Coke high. The sugar's just rolling out of their pores, and they probably can't wait to do something. But apparently there was an entrepreneur, a French entrepreneur, that bought a smelter and turned it into an ice factory so he could, make money off of the Coke, cooling the Coke, and later tried to get franchise for it because he had so many Coke bottles there. So we left the museum and walked around the streets of Noumea, and if you look at the cars, they look like you're really in France, because just about everyone is a Peugeot or Renault. But Burger King was there and made themselves well known. And Janet mentioned she had lived in France for about a year, and the city was laid out like any city in France. They'd have plazas and gardens, and here you can see one of the beautiful water. Not a waterfall, but a fountain. And when we walked around, they'd have a historical kiosks, and this one was of a bandstand that was in the middle of one of the plazas, and it said that the Army band would play there. So they also entertained the folks in town. We're just taking a look again at the dockings that were provided and so essential to the war effort there. Another picture of the 1942 or 3 of the docks, loading of the ships. And then here's what those docks look like today. So container ships, and there's a cruise ship there, which we found out was a cruise ship that we'd be on in 2 months in climbing on board in Australia just before the pandemic. So it was nice to see the Nordum there. And that day we had the appointment with the museum curator, which she curated both the cultural museum here and then also the museum that was the World War II museum. In the courtyard, since it's a cultural museum, they also honored the Kanak peoples, and this is one of their very, very well sculpted wood carvings in the courtyard. And then they also in the museum talked a lot about the history and the strife between the two peoples there, which we'll learn a little bit more in a minute. But these were souvenirs that they would give you a custom certificate to make sure you can take it out of the country because it's not a true artifact. I had one of those certificates in the Solomons for one of the Coke bottles. So this was Veronique de la France. She's the curator. We sat down and I think we spoke to her for 45 minutes or so, maybe an hour. She was really intrigued with all the information about the hospitals and the the buildings that went on, and then also wanted any information at all about it because they were intended to do a special exhibit on it. And she had told us that in December, so this was in October of 2020, they'd sent somebody over to gather more information from New Caledonia, but that was during COVID, so we never heard anything more about it. But hopefully they're still doing the exhibit on it. The area where the hospitals are, some of it's private property, and the private property owner actually created a museum on the property. I'm sure most of it is, probably few, if any, of the buildings are there, but the concrete would be for sure there. So she tried to get us in that day. We had no knowledge about this. She tried to get us in that day, and unfortunately, I think it just didn't work out. So it'll just have to be for the next trip. So we had this time now. What do we have? I mean, we're tourists. We're in Noumea. We went to a tourist bureau and we tried to find the most touristy thing we could possibly do. And we found it. It was called the Little Green Train. And the car or the truck that pulls it looks like a train. And it pulls these 3 cars. And we were waiting and waiting and waiting, and we're the only ones on the train. It'd get time for us to leave. So I, in my most competent high school French, tried to talk to the conductor and wondering, are we going to leave? Are you waiting for more people? Are you going to go just with us? And he told us that it was not to worry. They were going to pick up some people on the way. So there we go. We're off and running with the empty train in the streets of Noumea, with everybody looking at just the 2 of us in the train. And but we made a stop, and then all of a sudden the whole train's full. It's a summer camp of kids and their moms, and we had this just gorgeous little girl in front of us. So we drove through the streets, and when you drive through the streets with the summer camp, driving up the mountains, this is what it's like.
Down at the other side. Now we are going up to our stop, Wentoro. Wentoro comes from the southern province vernacular language. It means.
So they're sightseeing in French and in English. But you can see a little bit of it from Noumea from the mountain area. All those warehouses and buildings are virtually gone. So that ride up the mountain back at that time looked like that in 1942. But probably the highest building was 3 stories at the highest. And now it looks like that. Before the US came there, there was a Australian force that was sent called Robin Force. There's about 200 of Australian soldiers, and they were coastal battery units. And they went there to set up large cannons to protect the bay and the port of Noumea. And we visited one of them, and you can see the commanding view that it has of the whole harbor, probably 10 miles out to Isle Nou, they called it. And I'm sure the tree was not there at the time, so they had even a greater view of it. But I checked the cannon, and it was made in Australia. And it's a very, very significant artillery piece. And we had to get a selfie with our tour director. She's got a special baseball cap there that was to highlight some of the culture there. And then we were in the background by the cannon. So while we were driving around the streets, here's a picture of Noumea in 1942, where partially assembled P-38 Lightning fighters were driven through the streets in order to reach their final assembly buildings. So I mentioned the population. So they said it was 53,000. And while the US base was there, they figured it was nearly over a quarter million people that were there. So it was like 1 out of every 4 were New Caledonians. The rest were US or New Zealanders, or in some cases Australians. So when you're on the little green train with the summer school, and you come to the student, not the student area, but the tourist area, what do you do? Well, we learned that what you do is this.
Lemon Beach.
What you do is you say hello to everybody. So all the kids are screaming, hello, 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 trying to entice somebody to wave back at them. Just a momentary freeze here. Let me take you back. And as we were ending our tour, we were by the police station, as witnessed by the police cars. This is another banyan tree. And if you remember from last week, the banyan tree cannot support itself. It can only grow being alongside another tree that has more structure. And as it gets older, it roots more and more until it intertwines, and it actually forms its own tree structure itself so it can stand, probably killing the other tree. But that was right there in town by the police station. Across the street was this fairly comfortable looking building. It has balconies, and it has really nice ornamental window coverings. And the strange thing about it was when we found out that it was the police station, it doesn't look like too bad of a place to have to be interned there for a day or two. So we're kind of summing it up. Once that open valley that they first arrived at that looked like a cow pasture ended up being completely filled up with necessary support buildings for the war effort in the Pacific. They, the 353rd, before they were broken up, they received a commendation from the major general in the area. And they recognized that they had very little resources and worked very long hours in order to get the job done in building the 8th General, 29th General Hospitals, the 5th Convalescent, which was, I think, that rest camp that we referred to. Also realigning and building highways and Route 1 there. The nickel area paving they recognized, and also the Ile Embo demonstration area. So with that, there was a lot of thanks given to the entire regiment. But at that time, the regiment was being disassembled into smaller units that could go to different places for different needs. So they had a special ceremony. And then at the end of the book, they basically talked about how happy they were and proud they were of what they did. And they'll always look back and be thankful for those times that they spent together. So in 11 May, 44, they left New Caledonia and went to Bonica, which is where we were last week. This is one of the commanding generals of the Marical Division, which was what he was part of. And it just basically said that your victory came because you fought and worked for it unceasingly against terrible odds. Now you must preserve that victory so that your nation may benefit from what you have won, which were great inspirational words. Unlike last week where we talked about Michener, and Michener's Tales of the South Pacific centered around cultural and racial bias that either he had experienced there. This has a different story. New Caledonia is a totally different story. When we were at the museum, we saw the video, and what the video claimed was that because of the American influence, they changed their culture. They saw things that they had never seen before and saw how they worked. So one of the big impacts was when they needed soldiers, or excuse me, they needed stevedores to unload the ships. And they didn't have enough of the French New Caledonians. So the US did what they had to do. They hired Canucks and other natives, they call them, in order to unload them. And they admit that the war changed the economic and social patterns of New Caledonia and had a particular impact on the underprivileged, like the indigenous and the indentured workers that worked in the mines, and also on women. This is kind of cute play on word indigenous. Well, this is the indigiais. So the French administration there tried to control who they were recruiting, particularly the Melanesians and the Canucks, so that they couldn't work for the US military. They wanted to work for the military because they paid 45 francs a day and they gave them clothes. The French were only allowed to pay them 23 francs a day, and it was by a governmental decree. So there was a huge change, a whole huge shift in some of their social mores when that happened. Also, the healthcare was open to everybody from the hospital units. So that mentioned that elephantitis and leprosy, maybe some of that got cured. And this is a representation of one of the stevedores and kind of a summary where they had the American dream. He was unloading the ships, and he made some money off of it. He remembered all the music and the balls and the cinema sessions for the kids. But in 1946, they left, the GIs left. But from that, everything changed for that population. So they became citizens. They could move around freely. Gone are the days of head tax, forced labor, unfair sanctions. So they anticipated the ability to vote, which they can today. It was so much appreciated that 50 years after the landing there from 42, the French dedicated a memorial to the Americans. And every year they have a ceremony there to rededicate it. So pretty significant impact there, much different than in other places. So this is our journey home. In the lower left-hand corner, New Caledonia to Port Vila to Nadi, Fiji to LA, and then somewhere in the right black zone is LA to Chicago. So there's, we left on November 8th. We traveled 31 hours and we arrived here on November 8th. I don't know how that worked. So we were happy. That was when we got home. I don't know, it was 2 in the morning or whatever. What I wanted to do just briefly, if you're interested in going to the museum site, it's a long name, like I said, but it's easy to remember. World War II, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, southpacific.org. And what I can, that's how you navigate it. When I'm going to go to it directly now and just show you quickly how it works. So the home is up here. It's harder to see because it's smaller, but it's not like that on your home computer. This should be familiar to you. We had these in the presentation, but you can explore pictures. You can explore maps.
Scott, if you want the Zoom audience to see, you need to share that screen.
Sorry, what?
If you want the Zoom audience to see that, you need to say, share your screen and then point to that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't have a Zoom screen right now, so I just wanted to show that there's letters there from Roman Click, who was a co-author of the website, and it's his letters to his aunt from the day that he left to the day that he came home, 3.5 years worth. There's documents of personal history and also about the individual units, and then some personal collections. There's some of their newsletters in the dozer, the people who have supported this in the past 30 years, and then how to contact. In case you want to contact us, you can contact me through there or through my name, Scott Saewert at Comcast.net. So with that, I'm going to go back to the presentation. And end it. By really thanking you for being here, not only here, but on the Zoom as well. And we really appreciate your interest in, and I hope you learned a little bit more about places you may have never heard of before. And I'd encourage you, if you ever want to make the trip, it's well worth it. So thanks so much for coming today, especially in the weather. Okay.
Scott, if there's questions in the meeting room, could you repeat the question for the Zoom
Sure.
audience?
Yes, sir.
Real good presentation. When you're in New Caledonia, when you were there, you mentioned you speak French and that Janet had spent time in France. Is that necessary, or do most people there speak English?
We had success in speaking English. Oh, I'm sorry, I'll repeat this question. When we went to New Caledonia, did we have to speak French to communicate, or was English also common? So, and the answer is you could speak English. Most of the tourist areas would understand it and would be able to work with you on it. I probably did it just to think that I could try to do it with my high school French. But you definitely can just use English. I think maybe if you go into the city itself and maybe the day-to-day people that are there, we were on we took buses and we tried to get off at a stop, and the bus went right by it. It only stopped there on the way back. So we had some people on the bus and were like, you know, what's going on? So they helped us out with that. And so we were able to get back on track, but that was through English. Okay. Any other questions? Anything on Zoom, Terry?
There's a couple of comments. Somebody mentioned that the filming of Walking with the Dinosaurs was on New Caledonia. And they also mentioned that New Caledonia is actually a very ancient continental crust and not volcanic.
Very good. Thank you for that.
And then somebody was raising their hand, Sandra Lee, if you want to unmute or put your question in the chat box.
Thank you.
Bye now. Thank you.
Sandra Lee, if you want to ask a question, you can unmute. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Who is this mystery girl that your dad spoke so highly of by the name of Elvira?
Boy, I couldn't catch that in here with the acoustics.
Scott, they asked what the mystery woman, who was the mystery woman that your dad named Elvira?
Jake, I think you can answer that yourself, right? Is this Jake?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
I'll have to do a little research on that.
Thank you. Thank you for being there for me, Jake.
Also, Vi, if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Oh, I was just really interested in hearing you like trace your dad's history during the war, and that kind of got me interested in trying to find out what my dad did. He's now deceased. I was wondering, where is a good place to start looking for this kind of information if he was in the Navy?
He's in the Navy. So I think a good place to start would be if you still have any of the old documents, perhaps pertaining to the service that he might have had. There's that DD 214, which is the separation paper. That's when they're released from service. They're given this paper and it outlines very briefly what services and companies or battalions or ships they were on. And it also indicates their rank and for how long it was and the length of the service. So that would be, if you can find that, that would be a good place to start. Another way to do it would be there's some websites that advertise having military information, like I think it's called myheritage. It's either .com or .org, myheritage.com or .org. So you can start there. I know Ancestry does have some capabilities of searching military history. And because I've searched some of my own, my uncles on it, and you will get some hits on it, whether through local papers when they were in the service or through military documents that they might have already scanned. So that's where I would suggest you start, either in-house with that separation paper, or you can go online at those couple different sites and give it a go.
Hey, Scott, I missed the address of that museum again. This is Bill Broad.
Hi, Bill. Yeah.
I need the address, the WWII.
Oh,
What's
for
the full?
the website address. So, okay, it's WW numeral 2
Right.
U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, South Pacific.org.
Okay, WWII U.S. Army Corps of Engineers South.
Yeah, I don't think Terry, is Zoom still working, or? if I-
Yes, but I can send that out in my follow-up email and send it out to everybody who attended today. That
Okay.
way they'll have the link.
Oh, that's right. I put it in the back. So here I can display it as well. It's right here. Yeah. So there it is on the bottom. If you can see it on your bottom of your screen. US or WW2 number 2 U.S. Army Corps of Engineers South Pacific.org.
Oh, it starts with U.S. Okay.
No, it starts with, it's actually WWW, but you don't have to put that in.
Yeah.
It's W, so then after you'd have the www dot for
Yeah.
the website. You'd actually, all you have to do is put in WW2 U.S.
Yeah.
Army Corps of Engineers South Pacific.org.
Okay, thank you.
Just like it is up on top or on the bottom here. But yeah, thanks for the question, Bill.
Yeah.
All right, Scott, there's no other questions in Zoom.
I'm off the hook. Thanks so much.
Yeah,
Thank you, Scott.
thank you for sharing your father's journey with us and your trip.
Oh, you're welcome, Perry. Thank the library as well for allowing this to happen.
Yeah, now the encore presentations are all still available, aren't they, Terry?
It'll be available on the 31st. Yes.
Okay, just this one? But the other 2 weeks?
If you want, I can send you a link for all of them.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
All right. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a good afternoon. Hopefully, we're done with the storm.
Yeah.